So you finally decided to book a trip to Africa, and who knows, maybe you've even convinced a friend that Africa isn't this dangerous place, but instead it's a continent filled with so much beauty, history, and culture. Now what do you do? Well, on this video, I'm going to discuss 5 things you need to know before you plan your trip to the continent of Africa. All right, welcome back and thank you for watching this video as we discuss the 5 different things that you need to know before you start booking a trip to Africa. Now, the reason why I want to make this video is that a lot of people sometimes come to me with all sorts of questions, or sometimes I have to avoid them to traveling to a country like during their rainy season or during the bad time period for that country. And so what I really want you guys to do, and it's really just the overall goal of why I started this platform, is really maximize your trip to the continent, because I want you to fall in love with it as much as I did. And I want you to have such a good experience that a lot of y'all who are in the diaspora, you're going to be like, man, I'm going to end up moving to Africa. And some of you guys that are on the continent, I want you guys to start traveling a lot more to your neighbors, getting to know the history, the culture, and making those connections across the continent. All right. Now, without further ado, let's get into number 1. Now, the first tip is do not let the flight prices scare you about traveling to Africa. Now, the flight prices to Africa can be anywhere between $1,200 to $1,800, if not more. And a lot of people hit me up and they'll be like, well, for much cheaper, I can get a flight to Europe. And while that might be true, when you do get to Europe, you're paying out the yayo for hotels, food, taxis, so on and so forth. Whereas when you travel to the continent of Africa, in a lot of countries, all of that is much cheaper and more cost efficient. For example, I once traveled to northern Ethiopia and I stayed at a decent hotel for $10 a night. All right. And so while, yes, your flights might be cheaper going to a lot of different countries, overall, your trip will be much, much cheaper traveling to the continent of Africa. All right. The second thing you need to know before planning your trip to Africa is you need to know the seasons and the weather. And what I mean by that is, first off, Africa is very unique in that it's really the only continent in the world where almost half of the continent is in the northern hemisphere and the other half is in the southern hemisphere. Okay. And so what that means is, let's take a country like South Africa. You may want to go to South Africa in, let's say, June or July, which is your summer, but to them, it's their winter. And despite what you might believe, Africa is not always hot. Okay. You travel to South Africa, and depending on where you're at in their wintertime, you're going to need at least a nice little coat or a nice little jacket. Conversely, if you do have countries that are very, very hot, maybe you do want to travel there during their winter time. So, for example, people know Egypt as being a desert and is extremely hot. Well, I traveled there in December and it got a little nippy. It was their winter time, and sometimes I actually did need a light little jacket. But it was a lot more bearable and a lot easier to travel to in December versus traveling there during June, which I can only imagine pretty unbearable. So knowing the hemispheres and where these countries are located is a huge part of traveling to these countries. Also, it's also beneficial to know when in these countries' rainy seasons. So in West Africa, for example, they typically have their rainy seasons in June, July, and August. So I've had people hit me up and say, hey, I'm planning a trip to Sierra Leone in August, and that's cool and everything, but y'all up here packing swim trunks when you really need to be packing your umbrellas. Because in Sierra Leone particularly, it can sometimes rain for 7 days straight. Heavy. So it's just something to think about. All right, now listen, Africa has 54 different countries, and a lot of them are vastly different. But overall, I would say that the best time to travel to the continent is probably December for a lot of different countries. And the reason why I say that is, number one, December is what they call clubbing season. And it's when a lot of people from the diaspora, a lot of second generation folk travel back to the continent. And, number one, they're seeing family for the seasons, but then also they are hitting the clubs. And they typically call that clubbing season. And it's a good time for the nightlife. But also in December is when you have a lot of southern hemisphere countries, they're experiencing their summer. And then a lot of Western countries or countries in West Africa, they're experiencing their dry season. And then you have countries in the northern of Africa, it's their winter time, so it's not blazing hot. So overall, in December is typically, I would say, where a lot of countries have their best times to travel to the continent. All right, the third thing that you need to know before planning a trip to Africa, and is really a question I'm going to ask to you, is what type of trip are you planning? A lot of people will hit me up and they'll be like, yo, I'm trying to go to Africa. Which country should I go to? And my question to them is immediately, okay, well, what type of trip are you trying to plan? What are you trying to get from your vacation? Right? Because you have 54 different countries in Africa, and all of them provide a different array of value that they're going to provide to you, the traveler. Right? You have some countries that are really good for beaches, like Kenya, Tanzania, a lot of countries on the west coast of Africa. You have some countries that are really good for adventure, like South Africa and Zambia. You have some countries that are really, they are chock full of history and rich culture. Countries like Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Ghana, just so many different countries that provide that for you. You have some people that they're trying to plan a trip where they want to connect with their roots. And for that, of course, a lot of countries on the west coast of Africa provide a direct lineage, especially for us of the diaspora. You have some people that they want to plan a trip where they can just lay low for a little bit. And there's tons of places in Africa overall where, you can lay low, decompress, and really take a lot of that stress from work, etc., that you maybe built up over the past several months or years. And then some people, they're looking for a nice little romantic vacation, a nice little romantic getaway. And there's tons of places available for it. Some of them that are like hidden gems. I had people hit me up recently. They went on a nice romantic honeymoon to Malawi, right? And they sent me pictures, and it was very beautiful. So they had them a nice, romantic and lustful vacation honeymoon to Malawi. But there's so many other different places. There's of course, the obvious Seychelles, Mauritius. One place that I'm looking forward to is I'm probably gonna mispronounce it, but Sao Tome, and just a lot of different hidden gems all over the continent. If you are looking for a nice romantic getaway. The fourth thing that you need to know before you start booking a trip to Africa is the fact that some of these countries are a little bit more user-friendly than other countries, right? And that's due to several different reasons. One could be the fact that some of these countries have a little bit better infrastructure set up, so it's a little bit more tourist-friendly to travel to. Some of these countries are cities where the population is a little bit overwhelming. And then some of these countries have cultures that are so intense, because you have to keep in mind, a lot of these countries in Africa, they have cultures that stem back thousands of years ago, right? And so their customs, their traditions can be a little intense for somebody who's not used to traveling on the continent. So I would say that for your first time, especially if this is your first time traveling to the continent, you want to travel to countries that are a little bit more user-friendly, like Ghana, South Africa, Kenya. There's a long list, but if you're not an experienced traveler, I would suggest that you travel to one of those countries, get your feet wet a little bit, and then you can travel more throughout the continent once you, number one, shed that whole westernized ideology of what Africa is, about Africa being dangerous, so on and so forth. What traveling to one of these user-friendly countries will allow you to do first, it'll at least take away that whole mindset, and then you'll be a lot more comfortable traveling on the continent, and then you can travel to those other places. All right, number 5, the fifth thing that you need to know before you start booking your trip to Africa is knowing the visas and vaccinations. And I think I talked about this a little bit on Instagram, but knowing the visas and vaccinations is very important. So just as a general rule, I just generally say, especially if you plan on traveling to more than one country in Africa, is just to go ahead and get your yellow fever shot, because that way, if you do plan on bouncing from country to country, then you're good and taken care of. But basically, what you need to do, if you get a yellow fever shot, they'll give it to you like this. You put it in your passport, and then you're good to go. If you're traveling from outside the continent, and really it depends on which country you're traveling to. Some countries require you to have a yellow fever. Some countries don't. But just It's a general rule. I just say just go ahead and have it, because some countries I've traveled to say they don't check it and they've checked it. Some countries I've traveled to say they check it and then they don't check it. So it's up in the air. So just go ahead and get it out the way. But the next thing is the visas. And the visas, some depending on where you're traveling from and where you're traveling to, you may need a visa to travel to that country. So what I do suggest you do is go on that country that you're traveling to, go to their government website, and they'll typically tell you whether or not you need a visa from where you're coming from or where you're a citizen of. And also make sure you check out the time in which it would take to process the visa, because I tried to get a visa for Sudan years ago, and I sent off my visa like 2 months before it was about 6 weeks before my trip, and I never got my visa. Okay, to the point where after 6 weeks, I had to tell them like, yo, just send my passport back because y'all just playing around. So it just make sure you check out the process time, and then plan accordingly and plan your trip out accordingly. All right, well that's all 5 for today. Thank you for watching this video, and listen, if this is your first time, don't forget to subscribe. And as I mentioned before, I'm getting my data back, all my footage back. So hopefully I'll start back posting up more content on a regular basis. Okay, so please stay tuned, and thank you for your patience. All right, I will see you guys on the next video. Peace, love, and I'll holler at you guys later.